The fluorescent lights buzzed quietly in the 12th Precinct's lobby on a busy Monday morning. Officer James Bennett sat at the front desk, his clean-pressed blue uniform a stark contrast to his less-than-professional attitude. At 34 years old, with 8 years on the force, he thought he had seen it all. His phone screen glowed as he scrolled through social media, barely glancing up when people approached his desk. The morning crowd had thinned out when the glass doors swung open, letting in a gust of autumn air. Sarah Marshall walked in with purposeful steps, her charcoal gray suit perfectly tailored, and her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun. At 52, she carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that came from decades of professional success, though this wasn't apparent to the dismissive officer at the desk. Bennett didn't bother to look up from his phone when she approached. "Take a number and have a seat," he muttered, gesturing vaguely to the waiting area. "Excuse me, officer," Sarah said firmly, placing her leather briefcase on the floor beside her. "I'm here to file a complaint about ongoing noise violations at 1242 Maple Street. This is my third attempt to address this issue." Finally glancing up, Bennett's eyes swept over her with barely concealed disinterest. His fellow officer, Mike Rodriguez, leaned against the wall nearby, watching the interaction with a smirk. "Ma'am," Bennett drawled, emphasizing the word in a way that made it sound more like an insult than a courtesy. "Noise complaints aren't exactly emergency situations. There's a form for that." He slid a wrinkled paper across the desk without even checking if it was the correct document. Sarah picked up the paper, noting it was actually a parking violation form. "Officer Bennett," she said, reading his nameplate, "I believe you've given me the wrong form. Additionally, I've already submitted 3 formal complaints through your online system. According to Municipal Code Section 23.4, repeated noise violations require official police documentation and investigation." Bennett's eyebrows shot up, and he exchanged an amused look with Rodriguez. "Oh, so you're a lawyer now," he chuckled, making no attempt to hide his condescension. "Did you get your law degree from Google University?" Several people in the waiting area shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Sarah remained perfectly composed, though her fingers tightened slightly on the strap of her briefcase. "The noise from this property has been ongoing for 3 months," she continued calmly. "They're operating what appears to be an illegal auto repair shop in a residential zone. The work continues well past midnight, affecting several families in the neighborhood." Bennett leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Look, lady, if you don't like living in the city, maybe you should move to the suburbs. Some people actually have to work for a living, even if it disturbs your beauty sleep." Rodriguez snickered from his position by the wall, encouraging Bennett's behavior. Sarah noticed how other civilians in the lobby, particularly people of color, were watching the scene with resigned familiarity. Just then, the elevator doors opened, and Captain Thomas Chen stepped out, engaged in conversation with another officer. He was thumbing through some papers when his head snapped up at the sound of Sarah's voice. "Officer Bennett, I would like to speak with your supervising officer," Sarah was saying, her voice level but firm. "Yeah, I'm sure you would." Bennett rolled his eyes, reaching for his phone again. "Take it up with City Hall if you're so concerned about the proper channels." Captain Chen's footsteps quickened as he approached the desk. His face had gone slightly pale as he recognized the woman standing there. "Judge Marshall," he exclaimed, causing Bennett to freeze mid-motion, his phone halfway to his face. "I had no idea you were coming to the precinct today. Is everything all right?" The silence that fell over the lobby was deafening. Bennett's phone slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the desk. Rodriguez straightened up so quickly he almost lost his balance. Sarah turned to face the captain, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. "Good morning, Captain Chen. I was just discussing with Officer Bennett here the importance of taking civilian complaints seriously. Perhaps we should continue this conversation in your office?" Bennett's face had drained of all color as the realization hit him. He had just spent the last 10 minutes mocking and dismissing Federal Judge Sarah Marshall, one of the most respected legal minds in the state and a well-known advocate for police accountability reform. The morning that had started so ordinarily for Officer James Bennett was about to become one he would never forget. Captain Chen's office door closed with a soft click, leaving Officer Bennett alone at the front desk. His hands were shaking slightly as he tried to focus on the computer screen in front of him. The morning's events kept replaying in his mind, each replay making him feel worse than before. Rodriguez, who had been so quick to laugh earlier, was now nowhere to be seen. The other officers passing through the lobby avoided making eye contact with Bennett, though he could hear their whispered conversations and occasional snickers. Meanwhile, in Captain Chen's office, Judge Marshall sat in a leather chair, her posture perfect as she detailed the morning's events. The captain sat behind his desk, his face growing more concerned with each word she spoke. "This isn't just about my personal experience, Captain," Sarah explained, opening her briefcase. "Over the past 3 visits to this precinct, I've observed a troubling pattern of behavior." She pulled out a small notebook filled with detailed notes. "Last Tuesday, I watched Officer Bennett tell a Hispanic mother with 3 children that she should learn English before coming to file a report about her stolen car." Captain Chen's frown deepened. "Judge Marshall, I want to assure you that this kind of behavior is not what we—" 2 weeks ago, she continued, flipping through her notes, an elderly black man tried to report suspicious activity around his store. Officer Bennett suggested he was paranoid and should stop wasting police time. That store was robbed 3 days later. The captain's face had turned ashen. Sarah closed her notebook and looked at him directly. "I didn't come here today just as a resident with a noise complaint, Captain. I came because I needed to experience firsthand what my neighbors have been telling me for months." She placed her notebook on his desk. The dismissive attitude, the casual racism, the complete disregard for community concerns, it's all documented here. Outside in the lobby, Bennett tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept wandering. He remembered all the times he brushed off complaints with a laugh, all the times he'd made assumptions based on appearance. It had always seemed harmless to him, just a bit of fun to make the long hours more bearable. Now, every past interaction was coming back to haunt him. The Asian teenager he'd mocked for her accent when she reported harassment. The black business owner he'd dismissed when he complained about vandalism. The elderly immigrant he told to go back where she came from when she tried to report a scam. Back in the office, Captain Chen was reviewing security footage from the past month on his computer. Judge Marshall sat quietly, watching as scene after scene confirmed her observations. "This goes beyond one officer's poor judgment," she said finally. "This represents a systemic failure in how this precinct interacts with the community it's meant to serve." The captain nodded slowly, his face grim. "What are you planning to do, Your Honor?" Sarah stood up, smoothing her suit jacket. "Officially, I'm going to file a comprehensive report with the police commissioner's office. Unofficially," she paused, looking through the office window at Bennett's hunched figure at the desk, "I think it's time this precinct underwent a complete overhaul of its civilian interaction protocols." As she left the office, Sarah walked past the front desk where Bennett sat. He quickly stood up, his face red with shame. "Your Honor, I want to apologize," he started, but she held up her hand. "Officer Bennett," she said quietly, so only he could hear, "the tragedy isn't that you disrespected a federal judge. The tragedy is that you would disrespect any citizen who came here seeking help." She picked up her briefcase. "Think about that." The lobby had grown quiet again, everyone watching as Judge Marshall walked toward the exit. Just before she reached the door, she turned back to look at Bennett one last time. "An officer? Expect a formal summons to appear before the Police Review Board next week. We'll be discussing your approach to community service in detail." As the glass doors closed behind her, Bennett sank back into his chair. His phone lay forgotten on the desk, his social media feed still open but no longer seeming important. For the first time in his career, he was beginning to understand the true weight of the badge he wore, and how badly he had failed to honor it. The long morning was far from over, and Officer James Bennett's real education was just beginning. The next morning, Officer James Bennett arrived at work 30 minutes early, something he hadn't done in years. Dark circles under his eyes showed he hadn't slept much. As he walked through the parking lot, he noticed his colleagues giving him strange looks and whispering among themselves. The story of his encounter with Judge Marshall had spread through the precinct like wildfire. Even the night shift officers had heard about it, and now everyone knew him as the guy who mocked a federal judge. "Bennett!" A sharp voice called out just as he reached the front steps. He turned to see Sergeant Maria Lopez striding toward him, her face stern. "Chief wants to see you in his office. Now." The walk to Chief Williams' office felt like the longest of his life. Officers he joked with just yesterday now turned away as he passed. Through the glass walls, he could see not only Chief Williams but also 3 other people he didn't recognize, all in suits. His hands were sweaty as he knocked on the door. "Come in, Officer Bennett," Chief Williams said, his voice unusually formal. "Please have a seat." The 3 strangers sat in a row of chairs along the wall. One of them, a woman with silver-rimmed glasses, was writing in a notebook. "Officer Bennett," Chief Williams began, "I assume you're aware of why you're here." Bennett nodded, his throat dry. "Yes, sir, about yesterday's incident with Judge Marshall." "Incident?" One of the suited men raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you call openly discriminating against citizens who come to this precinct for help?" Chief Williams held up a hand. "Mr. Rodriguez is from Internal Affairs. These other individuals are from the Civilian Oversight Committee. They're here because Judge Marshall's complaint has opened up a larger investigation." Bennett's stomach dropped. Internal Affairs? This was worse than he'd imagined. The woman with the notebook spoke up. "Officer Bennett, we've spent the morning reviewing security footage from the past 6 months. Would you care to explain this pattern of behavior we've observed?" She pressed a button on a remote, and the large screen on the wall came to life. Bennett watched in horror as video after video played, showing him dismissing complaints, making inappropriate jokes, and treating citizens with disrespect. I didn't realize," he stammered, but the third suited person, an older man with gray hair, cut him off. "Didn't realize what, officer? That your actions were being recorded? That the people you were mocking were human beings deserving of respect? Or that one day someone with enough authority would finally call you out?" Just then, there was another knock at the door. Captain Chen entered, holding a thick folder. "Chief, I have Judge Marshall's complete report here. She's documented over 30 instances of discriminatory behavior in our precinct over the past 3 months alone." He paused, looking at Bennett. "Many of them involving Officer Bennett." The room fell silent as Chief Williams flipped through the report. Bennett could feel sweat running down his back. "There's more?" Captain Chen continued. "Remember that robbery on Oak Street last month? The one where the store owner had tried to report suspicious activity 3 times? Judge Marshall is hearing that case next week. The store owner's lawyer is arguing that police negligence contributed to the crime." Bennett felt like the floor was disappearing beneath him. He remembered that store owner, an elderly black man who he dismissed as paranoid. Now that case was going to be heard by the very judge he disrespected. "Officer Bennett," Chief Williams said finally, closing the folder, "do you understand the severity of this situation? This isn't just about one bad day or one mistake. This is about a pattern of behavior that goes against everything we're supposed to stand for." "Yes, sir," Bennett managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "Judge Marshall isn't just any federal judge," the Internal Affairs investigator added. "She's been a leading voice in police reform for 15 years. She's helped write half the protocols we operate under. And yesterday, you treated her exactly the way she's been telling us some officers treat ordinary citizens, proving her point better than any report could." Chief Williams stood up, his expression grave. "For now, you're suspended pending a full investigation. Badge and gun on my desk." With trembling hands, Bennett removed his badge and weapon. As he placed them on the chief's desk, he realized how quickly his world had changed. Yesterday, he'd been laughing and joking about citizens' complaints. Today, he was facing the possibility of losing everything he'd worked for. As he left the office, you could feel every eye in the precinct on him. The weight of his actions, finally visible in the harsh light of consequence, felt heavier than any burden he'd ever carried. A week had passed since Bennett's suspension, but it felt like a lifetime. He sat in his small apartment, surrounded by takeout containers and unwashed coffee cups, staring at his phone. The local news had picked up the story, and social media was filled with comments about the racist cop who mocked a federal judge. His sister Katie's text message glowed on the screen. "Mom's asking why you haven't called her back. She saw the news, James. She's really upset." Bennett tossed the phone aside and rubbed his tired eyes. His mother had raised him and Katie alone after their father died, working 2 jobs to put them through school. She'd been so proud when he joined the police force. Now he couldn't bear to face her disappointment. The TV in the background caught his attention as Judge Sarah Marshall's face appeared on the screen. She was speaking at a press conference outside the courthouse. "This incident has brought to light a serious problem within our law enforcement system," she was saying, her voice steady and clear. "When citizens, particularly those from minority communities, are afraid to seek help from those sworn to protect them, we have failed as a society." Bennett's phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from the police review board, scheduling his hearing for next week. His hand started shaking as he read through the detailed list of complaints against him. Each one brought back memories he tried to forget. There was Mrs. Rodriguez, the Hispanic mother whose car had been stolen. He remembered how her children had looked up at him with frightened eyes when he'd mocked their mother's accent. And Mr. Chen, the elderly store owner who'd lost everything in the robbery he tried to prevent. The young black teenager he'd accused of making up stories when she reported harassment. A knock at his door startled him from his thoughts. He opened it to find Katie standing there, looking worried. "You look terrible," she said, pushing past him into the apartment. She wrinkled her nose at the mess. "And this place smells worse than your room did in high school." "What are you doing here?" Bennett asked, watching as his sister opened windows to let in fresh air. "Someone had to check if you were still alive," she said, starting to gather empty containers. "Mom's worried sick, and you won't answer anyone's calls." Bennett slumped onto his couch. "How can I face her, Katie? You know what she always taught us about treating everyone with respect, about standing up for what's right." Katie sat down beside him. "Yeah, I remember. I also remember you weren't always like this, James. What happened to that kid who used to stand up to bullies in school?" "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "Somewhere along the way, I started thinking it was okay to joke about people's problems. That it made me look tough, made the job easier." He paused, remembering Judge Marshall's words. "I forgot these were real people coming to us for help." His sister was quiet for a moment. "You know what the worst part is? Some of those people you dismissed, they remind me of Mom 20 years ago when she was struggling to raise us alone. Remember how some people treated her just because she was a single mother working 2 jobs?" The memory hit Bennett hard. He remembered his mother coming home exhausted, sometimes crying after dealing with people who looked down on her. He promised himself he'd never be like those people. "I really messed up, didn't I?" he whispered. "Yes, you did," Katie agreed. "But you know what Mom would say, it's not just about feeling sorry, it's about making things right." Just then, both their phones buzzed. It was a news alert. Judge Marshall was expanding her investigation into police conduct across multiple precincts. The headline mentioned systematic changes and community oversight. "She's not just after me," Bennett realized, reading the article. "She's using what happened to fix the whole system." Katie nodded. "Maybe that's your chance. Instead of hiding here feeling sorry for yourself, you could be part of the solution." Bennett looked around his messy apartment, at the evidence of his week-long pity party. Then he looked at the news article again, at Judge Marshall's determined face. "I need to clean up," he said finally, standing up. "Not just the apartment. Everything." "Good," Katie smiled, throwing him a garbage bag. "Because Mom's coming over tomorrow, and you're going to tell her exactly how you plan to make this right." For the first time in a week, Bennett felt a small spark of hope. The road ahead would be hard, but at least now he knew which direction to take. The police review board hearing room was packed on Monday morning. Bennett sat at a long table, wearing his best suit, with his union representative on one side and his newly appointed lawyer on the other. His mother and Katie sat in the back row, their faces showing a mix of concern and support. Judge Marshall sat among the board members, her presence commanding attention without saying a word. Next to her were 5 other board members, including 2 civilian representatives from the Community Oversight Committee. Officer James Bennett, the board chairman, began, adjusting his glasses. "We're here today to review multiple complaints regarding your conduct at the 12th Precinct. However, this investigation has revealed something much larger than your individual actions." The large screen behind them lit up, showing a chart of complaint statistics from the past 3 years. Red dots marked incidents of dismissed complaints, forming a clear pattern. "Over the past month," Judge Marshall spoke, her voice firm but not unkind, "we've interviewed over 50 citizens who attempted to file complaints at your precinct. Their stories shared disturbing similarities." She pressed a button, and a video started playing. Bennett recognized the elderly store owner, Mr. Chen, speaking to an investigator. I tried 3 times to report suspicious people around my store, Mr. Chen said in the video, his voice trembling. Each time, Officer Bennett told me I was being paranoid. Now my store is gone, my life savings, gone. More videos played. The Hispanic mother, Mrs. Rodriguez, described how her children were now afraid of police officers. A young black college student explained how her stalking complaint was ignored until she was actually attacked. Bennett felt sick watching these testimonies. In the back of the room, he heard his mother let out a small gasp. Officer Bennett, Judge Marshall continued, you're probably wondering why we're showing you all this. The truth is, your interaction with me that day opened a door we needed to open. Your behavior wasn't happening in isolation. The screen changed to show internal police communications, text messages between officers, and training materials. We found a culture of dismissiveness, one of the civilian board members explained. Officers joking about complaints in private chat groups. Training sessions that emphasized filtering out nuisance reports without proper criteria. Supervisors pressuring officers to keep complaint numbers low by simply not recording them. Bennett's union representative shifted uncomfortably beside him. This was bigger than anyone had expected. Your Honor, Bennett spoke for the first time, his voice hoarse. I know I was wrong, but I don't understand. Why are you sharing all this with me? Judge Marshall leaned forward slightly. Because, Officer Bennett, you have a choice to make. You can either be part of the problem or part of the solution. She stood up and walked to the center of the room. We're forming a special task force to rebuild community trust. We need officers who understand what went wrong and why, officers who've seen both sides of this issue. Bennett blinked in surprise. Was she suggesting what he thought she was? Your suspension will remain in effect for 3 months, the chairman announced. During that time, you'll be required to complete extensive sensitivity training, community service, and work with our Civilian Oversight Committee. After that, should you choose to accept, you'll join the new Community Relations Task Force. But, Bennett started, confused, why would you trust me after what I did? Sometimes, Judge Marshall replied, the best advocates for change are those who've seen the need for it firsthand. Your actions were wrong, Officer Bennett, but your potential to help fix this system might be valuable. In the back of the room, Bennett saw his mother wiping away tears. Katie gave him an encouraging nod. Additionally, Judge Marshall continued, we're implementing new protocols across all precincts. Body cameras must be active during all civilian interactions. Complaint filing procedures will be streamlined. And most importantly, we're establishing a civilian review committee that will meet weekly to assess police-community interactions. She turned to face Bennett directly. The question is, Officer Bennett, are you ready to be part of this change? Bennett stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. He thought about Mr. Chen, Mrs. Rodriguez, and all the others he'd dismissed. He thought about his mother's struggles and his own forgotten promises. Yes, Your Honor, he said firmly. I am. For the first time since their first encounter, Judge Marshall gave him a small, approving nod. The real work was just beginning. 3 weeks into his sensitivity training, Bennett found himself sitting in a community center in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods. The room was filled with local residents who had agreed to participate in the police department's new outreach program. Many of them were people whose complaints he had dismissed in the past. Mrs. Rodriguez sat in the front row, her 3 children beside her. She had reluctantly agreed to share her story with the group of suspended officers undergoing rehabilitation training. Bennett's stomach tightened as she stood up to speak. Last year, when my car was stolen, she began, her accent still present but her voice strong, I lost more than just a vehicle. I lost my way to take my children to school, my way to get to both my jobs. But worst of all, my children lost their trust in the police. Her youngest daughter, Maria, age 7, looked at Bennett with wide eyes. He remembered how he had laughed at their mother's broken English. Now, seeing the family up close, he noticed Maria's worn-out shoes and her brother's patched backpack. Every detail told a story he had refused to see before. Today, Mrs. Rodriguez continued, I want to ask Officer Bennett something. When you made fun of my English, did you know I spend every free moment studying? That I work as a cleaner during the day and a restaurant dishwasher at night to give my children a better life? Bennett stood up slowly, his voice shaking slightly. No, ma'am, I didn't know. I didn't try to know, and I'm deeply sorry for that. Dr. Lisa Chen, the cultural sensitivity trainer, stepped forward. This is what we call conscious awareness, Officer Bennett. It's about seeing the whole person, not just the surface. The next speaker was Mr. Thompson, the elderly black man whose store was robbed. He walked with a cane now, the stress of losing his business having taken a physical toll. Officer Bennett ignored my warnings 3 times, he said. That store was my life's work. My father opened it in 1963, during the height of segregation. We survived riots, recessions, everything. But we couldn't survive police indifference. Bennett felt tears forming in his eyes, but he forced himself to maintain eye contact. This was part of his learning, facing the real consequences of his actions. During the lunch break, Bennett sat alone, reviewing his notes. Dr. Chen approached his table. "You're doing better than you think," she said, sitting down. "The hardest part isn't learning new procedures or memorizing sensitivity guidelines. It's confronting our own biases and really changing how we see people." Bennett nodded, looking at the collection of family photos Mrs. Rodriguez had shared, birthday parties, school graduations, all centered around the car he had dismissed as just another stolen vehicle case. "I keep thinking about my mom," he admitted. "She worked 2 jobs too, just like Mrs. Rodriguez. How did I forget what that was like?" Dr. Chen smiled gently. "Sometimes we build walls to separate ourselves from others' pain. It makes the job easier, but it also makes us forget our own humanity." The afternoon session brought more stories, more painful realizations. A young black teenager described her fear of walking home alone after her harassment complaint was ignored. An elderly Asian couple spoke about vandalism at their restaurant that could have been prevented. At the end of the day, as people were leaving, little Maria Rodriguez approached Bennett's desk. She carefully placed a drawing in front of him. It showed a police officer helping a family, with a bright sun smiling down at them. "Mama says everyone can change," she said simply, then ran back to her mother. Bennett carefully folded the drawing and put it in his wallet. As he walked to his car, he saw Judge Marshall standing in the community center doorway, observing. "Progress?" she asked. "Baby steps," he replied honestly. "But I'm learning to see things differently. These aren't just complaints anymore. They're people, families, stories." Judge Marshall nodded approvingly. "That's where real change begins, Officer Bennett. Not in policy manuals or sensitivity worksheets, but in truly seeing each person's humanity." As Bennett drove home that evening, he passed Mr. Thompson's boarded-up store. Instead of turning away, he really looked at it, imagining the decades of history within those walls. He thought about his next assignment, working with the community to help rebuild it. For the first time in his career, he was learning to be not just a police officer, but a true guardian of his community. 2 months into his suspension, Bennett sat in the newly established Community Relations Office, reviewing the changes that had transformed the 12th Precinct. The once dreary front desk area now featured signs in multiple languages and a welcoming seating area. But the biggest changes weren't physical, they were operational. Judge Marshall's reforms had created waves throughout the department. Today, she was coming to evaluate their progress, and Bennett had been asked to present the new complaint handling system he helped develop. Officer Bennett called Sandra Martinez, the new civilian coordinator. The community feedback session is about to start. He entered the meeting room where 30 people sat, a mix of police officers and community members. Mr. Thompson was there, now serving as the head of the Civilian Oversight Committee. Mrs. Rodriguez had joined the Language Access Team, helping to train officers in basic Spanish and cultural sensitivity. 2 months ago, Bennett began, standing at the podium, I was part of the problem. Today, I want to show you how we're becoming part of the solution. He clicked through his presentation, showing the new protocols. Every complaint was now digitally recorded, with mandatory follow-up within 24 hours. Officers wore body cameras that couldn't be turned off during civilian interactions. Most importantly, a civilian review board met weekly to assess police responses. But numbers and procedures aren't enough, Bennett continued, his voice growing passionate. We needed to change how we think, how we see our community. He played a video showing the precinct's new welcome desk, where officers greeted people in their native languages. Another clip showed police officers attending community events, playing basketball with local kids, helping elderly residents with groceries. Officer Bennett, Judge Marshall spoke from her seat. Tell us about the Thompson-Rodriguez protocol. Bennett smiled, glancing at Mr. Thompson and Mrs. Rodriguez. The protocol is named after two people I once dismissed. It requires officers to document not just the complaint, but the human impact of each case. He showed a form where officers now had to note things like, complainant is a single mother working 2 jobs, vehicle is essential for childcare and employment, or business owner's family has operated store for 3 generations, represents lifetime of work. When you see the whole story, Bennett explained, it becomes impossible to dismiss anyone's concerns as trivial. The room grew quiet as he shared recent success stories. The auto repair shop that had bothered Judge Marshall had been properly investigated and relocated to a commercial zone. Mr. Thompson's new store had opened with security systems installed through a community partnership program. Mrs. Rodriguez's children were now part of a police-sponsored after-school program. But our proudest achievement, Bennett said, clicking to the final slide, is this. The screen showed a graph of community feedback scores. The line curved steadily upward over the past 2 months. Trust is returning, he said simply. Slowly, but it's returning. Judge Marshall stood up, walking to the front of the room. Officer Bennett, when I came to file that complaint 2 months ago, I had no idea it would lead to this. You've helped turn a moment of discrimination into a movement for change. She turned to address the room. This precinct is becoming a model for others. Next month, we'll begin implementing these reforms across the city. After the meeting, Bennett watched as officers and community members mingled, sharing coffee and conversations. Little Maria Rodriguez was showing a female officer her homework. Mr. Thompson was discussing security measures with a rookie cop. Quite a change from 2 months ago, said a voice behind him. He turned to find his sister Katie standing there. Mom would have loved to see this, she said softly. Their mother had passed away unexpectedly just a week ago, but not before seeing her son begin to change. She did see it starting, Bennett replied, touching the drawing Maria had given him, which he'd framed and hung on his office wall. She told me she was proud of me again at the end. Judge Marshall approached them, holding a document. Officer Bennett, your suspension ends next week. This is your reinstatement paper with a new assignment, heading the Community Relations Department. Bennett took the paper, his hands steady. Thank you, Your Honor. But this success isn't mine alone. It belongs to everyone in this room. She smiled. That's exactly why you're the right person for the job now. You've learned the most important lesson in law enforcement. We're all in this together. As Bennett looked around the room, he saw not complainants or cases, but neighbors and friends. The badge he would soon wear again felt less like a symbol of authority and more like a promise to his community. 1 year had passed since that fateful morning when Judge Marshall walked into the 12th Precinct. Today, the precinct was hosting its first annual Community Unity Day, and Officer James Bennett stood at the podium, looking at the crowd gathered in the community center's main hall. Hundreds of faces looked back at him, fellow officers, local residents, community leaders, and even reporters from national news networks. The 12th Precinct's transformation had become a blueprint for police reform across the country. A year ago, Bennett began, his voice clear and confident. I was a different person. I stood behind a desk and looked down on the very people I was sworn to protect. He paused, making eye contact with familiar faces in the crowd. Mrs. Rodriguez sat in the front row, now wearing the uniform of a police department translator. Her daughter Maria, now 8, wore a junior police badge and smiled proudly. Next to them, Mr. Thompson had traded his cane for a plaque recognizing his work as chairman of the Civilian Oversight Committee. But someone taught me a valuable lesson, Bennett continued, glancing at Judge Marshall, who sat on the stage. She showed me that true justice isn't about power. It's about service, understanding, and respect. The large screen behind him displayed photos from the past year, officers attending cultural sensitivity classes, community meetings, neighborhood cleanup events, and youth programs. Each image told a story of bridges being built and trust being restored. Today, I want to share some numbers with you, Bennett said, clicking to the next slide. Complaint resolution rates have increased by 85%. Response times have improved by 40%, But the most important number is this: community trust in our precinct has risen from 23% to 89%. Applause filled the room. Judge Marshall nodded approvingly, remembering the angry officer who had mocked her complaint a year ago. But numbers don't tell the whole story, Bennett continued. The real story is about people. He gestured to different faces in the crowd. It's about Mrs. Rodriguez, who not only helps us communicate better with our Spanish-speaking residents, but has inspired her children to consider careers in law enforcement. Maria waved her junior police badge excitedly. It's about Mr. Thompson, whose new store isn't just a business. It's a community hub where officers and residents meet for coffee and conversation every morning. Mr. Thompson smiled, adjusting his tie. His new store, rebuilt with community support, had become a symbol of transformation. And it's about every officer who learned to see beyond the badge, beyond the desk, beyond their own prejudices. Bennett's voice softened. My mother didn't live to see today, but she saw the beginning of this change. She told me something important before she passed, that sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest opportunities to do good. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the drawing Maria had given him a year ago, the one showing a police officer helping a family. This drawing hangs in every precinct in our city now, he said, holding it up. It reminds us of who we're supposed to be, not just law enforcers, but community guardians. Judge Marshall stood up and walked to the podium. Officer Bennett's story could have ended with a suspension and a mark on his record. Instead, it became the catalyst for change that has influenced police departments nationwide. Today, we're announcing the National Community Policing Initiative, based on the model developed here. The audience erupted in applause. Bennett felt tears in his eyes as he watched his sister Katie give him a thumbs up from the crowd. After the ceremony, as people mingled and shared refreshments, Bennett found himself face to face with Judge Marshall. Did you ever imagine this outcome when you walked into the precinct that day? He asked. She smiled. I hoped for change, Officer Bennett, but you exceeded every expectation. You turned your moment of shame into a movement of progress. Thank you, he said sincerely, for not giving up on me. We're not finished yet, she replied. There's still work to be done. Bennett nodded, watching as a group of new recruits chatted with community members. No, we're not finished. But now we know the way forward. As the evening wound down, Bennett walked through the precinct halls. The front desk where it all began was now a welcoming space staffed by officers who spoke multiple languages. On the wall hung a simple motto: serve with respect, protect with understanding. He touched his badge, remembering how close he'd come to losing it. Now it meant something different, not just authority, but responsibility. Not just power, but purpose. The lesson had been hard, but the change was real, and somewhere he knew his mother was proud.